Legend has said that King Arthur ruled Britain. He is a folk hero and a key player in the matter of Britain, a literary tradition from the Middle Ages. According to Welsh accounts, Arthur led the post-Roman Britons in conflicts with the Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th and early 6th century. The majority of historians who research the early medieval era do not view him as a historical character because his first appearances in the Annales Cambriae and the Historia Brittonum occur 300 years after he is thought to have lived. Gododin and other early Welsh poetic sources also contain his name. The character evolved via Welsh mythology, showing up as a mystical figure of legend, occasionally connected to the Welsh otherworld and Nubian, or as a great warrior protecting Britain from supernatural and human foes. Geoffrey of Monmouth's inventive and fantastical Historia Regum Britannia, published in the 12th century, was a major factor in the rise of the legendary Arthur as a figure of international fascination. Arthur was portrayed by Geoffrey as a British monarch who subdued the Saxons and built a sizable empire. Geoffrey's Historia contains a number of events and elements that are now essential to the Arthurian tale, such as Arthur's father Uther Pendragon, the magician Merlin, his wife Guinevere, the sword Excalibur, his conception at Tintagel, his final conflict with Mordred at Camlan, and his final resting place in Avalon. The Arthurian romance genre, which became a prominent branch of medieval literature, was founded by the French author Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, who also included Lancelot and the Holy Grail in the plot. The narrative emphasis in these French tales frequently moves from King Arthur to other individuals, such different knights of the Round Table. There is no single canonical version of the Arthurian legend, and the ideas, events, and characters differ greatly throughout texts. Before seeing a significant comeback in the 19th century, Arthurian literature flourished during the Middle Ages, but declined in the years that followed. The mythology is still well known in the 21st century, not just in literature, but also in comics, theater, movies, television, and other media. It was customary to regard King Arthur as a historical figure. He was first believed to have been a monarch, at least starting in the early 12th century, and a British war commander. However, there was a great deal of debate over his many actions, and modern academics and religious leaders largely disproved the widespread medieval notion that Jesus would live a very long life and return. The historicity of Arthur has been the subject of scholarly discussion since the 18th century. The majority of contemporary historians who write about the time period do not believe that Arthur was a historical man because the majority of the details of his biography are based on Welsh mythology, English tradition, and literary fiction. According to one school of thought, Arthur was a Romano-British leader who battled against the invading Anglo-Saxons somewhere in the late 5th or early 6th century. This view was supported by passages in the Historia Brittonum and Annales Cambriae. The first known mention of King Arthur can be found in the Historia Brittonum, a Latin historical compilation from the 9th century that is credited in some late manuscripts to a Welsh cleric named Nennius. It lists 12 battles that Arthur engaged in. These lead up to the Battle of Badon, where he is credited with killing 960 soldiers by himself. The Historia Brittonum's credibility has been called into question by recent research. Early Anglo-Saxon migration to Great Britain was reversed between 500 and 550, according to archaeological evidence from the Low Countries and what would become England. This is consistent with Frankish chronicles. According to John Davies, this is in line with the British triumph at Badon Hill, which Nennius ascribed to Arthur. It is also claimed that Arthur's grave was found in 1180 by the monks of Glastonbury. The Annales Cambriae from the 10th century, which also connect Arthur to the Battle of Badon, is the second work that appears to bolster the argument for Arthur's historical existence. In addition to mentioning the conflict of Camlan, which took place between 537 and 539 and claimed the lives of Arthur and Medraut, the Annales date this conflict to 516 to 518. These specifics have frequently been cited to support the historian's story and provide evidence that Arthur actually engaged in combat at Badon. However, there are issues with utilizing this source to back up the story in Historia Brittonum. According to recent studies, a chronicle started in Wales in the late 8th century served as the basis for the Annales Cambriae. Furthermore, it is impossible to be certain that the Arthurian annals were incorporated to the Annales Cambriae at that early date due to its complicated textual history. They might not have been in any previous collection of annals and were most likely added sometime in the 10th century. The Historia Brittonum was most likely the source of the Badon entry. Many contemporary historians do not include Arthur in their descriptions of sub-Roman Britain because of the dearth of compelling early evidence. At this stage of the inquiry, one can only say that there may well have been a historical Arthur, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him, according to historian Thomas Charles Edwards. Previous generations of historians were less skeptical of these contemporary admissions of ignorance. The Age of Arthur, the historian John Morris's history of sub-Roman Britain and Ireland, was structured around the alleged reign of Arthur. Nevertheless, he had little to say about an Arthur of the past. Another school of thought that maintained that Arthur had no historical existence at all arose in part in response to such arguments. The archaeologist Novel Myers noted that no figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time after reading Morris's Age of Arthur. The fight is mentioned, but Arthur is not mentioned in Gildas's Polemique de Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written in the 6th century while Badon was still alive. Neither the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle nor any extant document from 400 to 820 mention Arthur by name. The other important early source for post-Roman history that mentions Badon, Bede's early 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people, does not include him. Instead, Bede describes Ambrosius Aurelianus as the leader of the Britons at that battle, whose parents had died in the storm and who were of the royal race. I think we can dispose of him quite briefly, wrote historian David Dumville. The no smoke without fire school of thought is responsible for his inclusion in our history books. Since there is no historical evidence to support Arthur, we must exclude him from our history and, most importantly, from the titles of our books. Some academics contend that Arthur was first a folkloric figure who was credited with actual actions in the ancient past, or possibly a Celtic deity who was largely forgotten. They draw comparisons to individuals like Horsa and the Kentish Hengist, who may have been totemic horse gods who were later made famous. Bede gave these mythical characters a historical part in the Anglo-Saxon invasion of eastern Britain in the 5th century. Even whether Arthur was regarded as a king in the early writings is uncertain. He is referred to as Dux Bellorum and Miles in the Historia and the Annales, respectively, rather than Rex. Although his results are debatable, Andrew Breeze contends that Arthur was a historical figure who engaged in combat with other Britons around the present-day border between England and Scotland. He also claims to have pinpointed the sites of his engagements, as well as the time and location of his death. His conclusions, which they believe are predicated on chance similarities between geographical names, have been contested by other academics. There is no textual justification for separating Badon from the other battles, and it is hard to justify identifying Arthur as the leader in northern battles listed in the Historia Brittonum, while rejecting the implication in the same work that they were fought against Anglo-Saxons, remarks Nicholas Hyam. Arthur has been based on a number of historical figures, including the Welsh kings Owain Dantgwyn, Enion Gert, and Athrwis ap Murig. sub-Roman British rulers Riotimus and Ambrosius Aurelianus, and Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman officer who served in Britain in the 2nd or 3rd century. Nevertheless, no solid proof for these identifications has surfaced. There is still disagreement over where the Welsh name Arthur came from. The Roman name Gentile Artorius is the source of the most commonly accepted etymology. The word Artorius itself has a disputed and ambiguous etymology. The Latinization of a fictitious name, Artorios, which was derived from an ancient patronym, Arto-Ar-I-Yos, meaning son of the Bear-Osh warrior king, shows that Artorius may have had a Celtic origin, according to linguist Stephen Zimmer. The Old Irish personal name, Artri, comes from the root asterisk Arto-Arig, which means bear warrior king. However, this patronym is unattested. According to some academics, the fact that the name of the legendary King Arthur never appears as Artorius in early Latin Arthurian manuscripts, but only as Arthur or Arturus, is pertinent to this discussion. Some people think that the name Arthur came from the fact that Artorius would frequently become Archer when borrowed into Welsh. Arcturus, the brightest star in the constellation Bodas, next to Ursa Major, sometimes known as the Great Bear, is the source of the name Arthur, according to a different theory that has received little support from academics. In Boetes, people regarded the bright star Arcturus as the leader of the other stars and the guardian of the bear, because of its position in the sky and brightness. When borrowed into Welsh, it would have also become Archer. There are also additional possibilities, such as the Etruscan or Messapian roots of the name. The notion that Arthur never perished, but is instead anticipating his return in a secluded location, frequently in slumber, is a fundamental theme associated with the Arthurian legends. Prior to the 12th century, as evidenced in the Englinian Y. Bedau, there are allusions to the lack of a cemetery for Arthur, implying that he was perceived as eternal rather than deceased. Nevertheless, this poem does not suggest that his return was anticipated. Beginning in the early 12th century, many sources document a widespread belief in the return of King Arthur, albeit it is sometimes depicted in a critical and ridiculing manner. William of Malmesbury initially references his impending return in 1125. However, Arthur's grave is not visible, leading to the enduring belief in fables that he will return. The Miracles of Saint Mary of Leon, authored by the French clergyman and chronicler Herriman of Tournai, about 1145, while recounting events from 1113, references the Breton and Cornish belief in the continued existence of Arthur. In 1191, the purported tomb of Arthur was identified during a contrived discovery at Glastonbury Abbey. While many scholars contend that this may have stemmed from the abbey's desire to distinguish itself with a notable tomb, or from the Plantagenet regime's intention to eliminate a legendary rival who incited persistent Celtic resistance to their authority, it may also have been driven by the problematic nature of Arthurian expectations within contemporary Christianity. The desire for the return of a formidable immortal figure prior to the end of time to restore his ideal dominion not only contradicts fundamental Catholic principles, but may also jeopardize the central emphasis on the anticipation of Jesus' return. This was exacerbated by the fact that narratives about Arthur often elicited stronger emotions than biblical accounts. Decades of elite criticism of the prevalent beliefs among devout Catholic Celts in Britain and Brittany failed to diminish these convictions, while the arrangement of Arthur's corporeal remains effectively precluded the prospect of his return without explicitly denouncing anyone's faith. Following the 1189 discovery of his purported grave, Arthur evolved into a character of folklore, purportedly resting in numerous secluded caves throughout Britain and beyond, and occasionally manifesting as a phantom during nocturnal pursuits, akin to the Wild Hunt. There are also additional possibilities, such as the Etruscan or Messapian roots of the name. The earliest literary mentions of Arthur originate from Welsh and Breton sources. Attempts to define the nature and character of Arthur within the pre-Galfridian tradition as a whole are limited, rather than focusing on individual texts or story types. A 2007 survey conducted by Caitlin Green identifies 3 primary aspects of Arthur's portrayal in the earliest material. He was an unparalleled warrior who served as the protector of Britain against all internal and external threats through monster hunting. Among these threats, some are human, exemplified by the Saxons encountered in the Historia Brittonum, while the majority are of a supernatural nature, including giant feline creatures, destructive divine boars, dragons, dog-headed beings, giants, and witches. The pre-Galfridian Arthur represents a figure of folklore, specifically within the realms of topographic and onomastic traditions, characterized as the leader of a group of superhuman heroes residing in the wilderness of the landscape. The third and final aspect is that the early Welsh Arthur had a significant association with the Welsh otherworld, Anne WN. He conducts assaults on otherworldly fortresses to acquire treasure and liberate their prisoners. Conversely, his warband in the earliest sources comprises former pagan deities, while his wife and possessions are evidently of otherworldly origin. A notable Welsh poetic reference to Arthur is found in the collection of heroic death songs titled Why Gododin, which is attributed to the 6th century poet Aneurin. A stanza from the oldest surviving manuscript commends the valor of a warrior who defeated 300 foes. However, it asserts that he was no Arthur, indicating that his accomplishments are not on par with those of Arthur. Why Gododin is preserved solely in a 13th century manuscript, making it difficult to ascertain the originality of this passage or the possibility of later interpolation. John Coke's assertion that the passage originates from a 7th century or earlier version remains unsubstantiated. Alternative datings in the 9th or 10th century are frequently suggested. Several poems attributed to Taliesin, a poet believed to have lived in the 6th century, reference Arthur. However, these works likely date from the 8th to the 12th centuries. They include Cadir Ternan, which refers to Arthur the Blessed, Praidu Anwen, which recounts an expedition of Arthur to the otherworld, and Mar Nat Vithir Pen, which highlights Arthur's valor and suggests a father-son relationship between Arthur and Uther that predates Geoffrey of Monmouth. Additional early Welsh Arthurian texts comprise a poem located in the Black Book of Carmarthen, titled Pagur Yivi Porthor. Who is the gatekeeper? The narrative unfolds as a dialogue between Arthur and the fortress gatekeeper, wherein Arthur details the names and accomplishments of himself and his companions, particularly Say and Bedwyr. In addition to these pre-Galfridian Welsh poems and tales, Arthur appears in some other early Latin texts besides the Historia Brittonum and the Annales Cambriae. Arthur appears in several notable vitae of post-Roman saints, none of which are regarded as reliable historical sources today, with the earliest likely originating from the 11th century. The Life of St. Gildas, authored in the early 12th century by Caradoc of Llancarfan, states that Arthur killed Gildas's brother Hwyl and rescued his wife Gwenhwyfar from Glastonbury. The Life of St. Cadoc, composed circa 1100 by Lyphris of Llancarfan, recounts an incident in which the saint offers protection to an individual who has slain 3 soldiers of Arthur. In response, Arthur seeks a herd of cattle as Svergold for his fallen men. Cadoc provides the animals as requested. However, upon Arthur's acquisition, they transform into bundles of ferns. Comparable events are documented in the medieval biographies of Caranog, Padarn, and Euflum, likely composed in the 12th century. A less renowned depiction of Arthur is found in the Legenda Sancti Goznovi, which is frequently asserted to originate from the early 11th century. However, the earliest manuscript of this work is from the 15th century, leading to its current dating in the late 12th to early 13th century. The references to Arthur in William of Malmesbury's De Gestis Regum Anglorum and Hermann's De Miraculis Sanctae Mariae Laudunensis are significant, as they offer the earliest definitive evidence of the belief that Arthur was not truly dead and would eventually return. This theme is frequently revisited in post-Galfridian folklore. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, completed around 1138, presents the earliest narrative account of Arthur's life. This work presents a creative narrative of British monarchs, spanning from the legendary Trojan exile Brutus to the 7th century Welsh king Cadwallader. Geoffrey situates Arthur within the same post-Roman era, as indicated by Historia Britonum and Annales Cambriae. Geoffrey's narrative posits that Arthur is a descendant of Constantine the Great. He includes Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, his magical advisor Merlin, and the narrative of Arthur's conception, wherein Uther, disguised as his adversary Gorlois, through Merlin's sorcery, engages with Gorlois' wife Igerna at Tintagel, resulting in Arthur's conception. Upon Uther's death, the 15-year-old Arthur ascends to the throne of Britain and engages in a series of battles akin to those described in the Historia Britonum, culminating in the Battle of Bath. He subsequently vanquishes the Picts and Scots, establishing an Arthurian empire through his conquests of Ireland, Iceland, and the Orkney Islands. Following a 12-year period of stability, Arthur embarks on a campaign to extend his empire, asserting dominance over Norway, Denmark, and Gaul. Gaul remains under the control of the Roman Empire at the time of its conquest, and Arthur's triumph results in an additional conflict with Rome. Arthur and his warriors, including Caius, Baduarus, and Gualguanus, achieve victory over the Roman Emperor Lucius Tiberius in Gaul. However, as Arthur plans to advance towards Rome, he learns that his nephew Modredus, whom he appointed to govern Britain, has wed his wife Gwenhwyra and usurped the throne. Arthur returns to Britain, defeats Modredus on the River Camblum in Cornwall, but sustains mortal wounds. The crown is entrusted to his kinsman Constantine, after which he is transported to the Isle of Avalon for the healing of his wounds, remaining unseen thereafter. The extent to which this narrative reflects Geoffrey's own invention remains a subject of debate. He appears to have utilized the list of Arthur's 12 battles against the Saxons as recorded in the 9th century Historia Britonum, in addition to the Battle of Camlin from the Annales Cambriae and the notion that Arthur remained alive. Arthur's designation as the king of all Britain appears to be derived from pre-Galfridian tradition, as evidenced in Culhwch and Olwen, the Welsh triads, and the lives of saints. Geoffrey appropriated numerous names for Arthur's belongings, immediate family, and associates from the pre-Galfridian Welsh tradition. These include Caius, Say, Beduerus, Bedwyr, Gwenhwyra, Gwenwyfar, Uther, and possibly Caliburnus, Caladfulch, the latter evolving into Excalibur in later Arthurian narratives. Nonetheless, despite the borrowing of names, key events, and titles, Brinley Roberts contends that the Arthurian section is Geoffrey's literary creation, and it owes nothing to prior narrative. Geoffrey transforms the Welsh Medrawd into the malevolent Modredus. However, there is no evidence of such a negative portrayal of this character in Welsh sources prior to the 16th century. Modern attempts to contest the idea that the Historia Regum Britannia is chiefly Geoffrey's creation are limited. Scholarly consensus frequently reflects William of Newburgh's late 12th century assertion that Geoffrey fabricated his narrative, possibly due to a excessive inclination towards falsehood. Geoffrey Ashe presents a dissenting perspective, positing that Geoffrey's narrative is partially based on a lost source, recounting the exploits of a 5th century British king named Rheodamus, whom Ashe identifies as the original Arthur. However, historians and Celticists have generally been hesitant to endorse Ashe's conclusions. The immense popularity of Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britannia is indisputable, regardless of his sources. More than 200 manuscript copies of Geoffrey's Latin work are documented to have survived, along with translations into various languages. 60 manuscripts containing the Brut I Brennened, Welsh language versions of the Historia, are extant, with the earliest dating to the 13th century. The idea that certain Welsh versions serve as the foundation for Geoffrey's Historia, proposed by antiquarians like Lewis Morris in the 18th century, has been largely dismissed in scholarly discourse. Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britannia significantly influenced the subsequent medieval evolution of the Arthurian legend due to its popularity. Although not the sole creative influence on Arthurian romance, it contributed several elements that were adapted and expanded, and it established the historical context for the romancer's narratives of magical and extraordinary adventures. The work of another French poet, Chrétien de Troyes, was the one that had the most significant impact on the development of Arthur's character and legend. Although Arthur and his entourage are mentioned in a few of Marie de France's lays, it was the work of Chrétien de Troyes that had the most significant impact. Approximately between the years 1170 and 1190, Chrétien penned 5 Arthurian romances. The stories of Eric and Eneide and Clige are about courtly love, and they take place in Arthur's court. These stories demonstrate a shift away from the heroic world of the Welsh and Galfridian Arthur. On the other hand, Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, features Yvain and Gawain in a supernatural adventure, with Arthur being largely on the sidelines and weakened. However, the most significant for the development of the Arthurian legend are Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which introduces Lancelot and his adulterous relationship with Arthur's queen Guinevere, extending and popularizing the recurring theme of Arthur as a cuckold, and Percival, the story of the Grail, which introduces the Holy Grail and the Fisher King, and which again sees Arthur having a much reduced role. Chrétien was therefore instrumental both in the elaboration of the Arthurian legend and in the establishment of the ideal form for the diffusion of that legend, and a significant portion of what came after him in terms of the portrayal of Arthur and his world was built upon the foundations that he had laid. There were 4 separate continuations of the poem that appeared over the next half-century, with the concept of the Grail and its quest being developed by other writers such as Robert de Boron. This fact contributed to the acceleration of the decline of Arthur in continental romance. Percival was particularly popular, despite the fact that it was not completed. In a similar manner, Lancelot and his cuckolding of Arthur with Guinevere became one of the prominent motifs of the Arthurian legend. However, the Lancelot depicted in the prose, Lancelot, and subsequent texts was a combination of Chrétien's character and that of Ulrich von Zatzikoven's Lanzelet. In fact, it seems that Chrétien's work has even been incorporated into Welsh Arthurian literature. As a consequence of this, the romanticized version of Arthur began to take the place of the heroic and active Arthur in Welsh literary tradition. The 3 Welsh Arthurian romances were particularly significant in this development. These romances are closely related to those written by Chrétien, albeit with some significant differences. Owain, also known as the Lady of the Fountain, is related to Chrétien's Yvain. Geraint and Enid are related to Eric and Enide, and Peredur, son of Efrog, is related to Percival. Until approximately 1210, continental Arthurian romance was predominantly conveyed through poetry. Subsequent to this period, the narratives transitioned to prose. The most notable of these 13th century prose romances was the Vulgate cycle, also referred to as the Lancelot Grail cycle, comprising 5 Middle French prose works authored in the first half of that century. The works include the Histoire del Saint Grail, the Histoire de Merlin, the Lancelot Propre, or Prose Lancelot, which constitutes half of the Vulgate cycle, the Quest del Saint Graal, and the Mort Arthur, collectively forming the first cohesive rendition of the Arthurian legend. The cycle perpetuated the trend of diminishing Arthur's significance in his own legend, partially through the introduction of Galahad and an enhancement of Merlin's role. Mordred was conceived from an incestuous union between Arthur and his sister Morgause, thereby solidifying Camelot, initially referenced in Chrétien's Lancelot as Arthur's principal court. The post-Vulgate cycle, which includes the Suite du Merlin, swiftly succeeded this series of texts, significantly diminishing the significance of Lancelot's relationship with Guinevere, while further marginalizing Arthur and emphasizing the Grail quest. Consequently, Arthur emerged as an increasingly peripheral character in these French prose romances. In the Vulgate, he is only prominently featured in the Histoire de Merlin and the Mort Arthur. During this time, Arthur was designated as one of the 9 Worthies, a collective comprising 3 pagan, 3 Jewish, and 3 Christian paragons of chivalry. The Worthies were initially enumerated in Jacques de Longuillon's Vœux du Paume in 1312, and subsequently emerged as a prevalent theme in literature and art. The culmination of the development of the Arthurian cycle in the Middle Ages and the character of the Arthur of romance was Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which was a single work written in English in the late 15th century that retold the entire legend. Malory appears to have aimed to create a comprehensive and authoritative collection of Arthurian stories throughout his book, which was initially titled The Whole Book of King Arthur and of His Noble Knights of the Round Table. Malory based his book on the various previous Romance versions, particularly the Vulgate cycle. Perhaps as a consequence of this, as well as the fact that William Caxton published Le Morte d'Arthur in 1485, making it one of the earliest printed books in England, the majority of later works featuring Arthurian characters are derivative of Malory's literary works. Around the time that the Middle Ages came to an end, there was a decline in people's interest in King Arthur. There were increasing attacks on the truthfulness of the historical framework of the Arthurian romances, which had been established since the time of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and consequently, on the legitimacy of the entire matter of Britain. This was the case despite the fact that Malory's English version of the great French romances was popular. For instance, the humanist scholar Polydore Vergil, who lived in the 16th century, famously refuted the assertion that King Arthur was the ruler of a post-Roman empire. This assertion can be found throughout the post-Galfridian medieval chronicle tradition, much to the dismay of antiquarians from Wales and England. The social shifts that occurred at the end of the medieval period and during the Renaissance also conspired to deprive the character of Arthur and the legend that was associated with him of some of their ability to captivate audiences. As a consequence, Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur was not printed again until 1634, which was nearly 2 centuries after it had been first published. Although King Arthur and the Arthurian legend were not completely abandoned, the material was not taken as seriously until the early 19th century. Prior to that time, it was frequently used as a vehicle for allegories of politics that occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries. As a result, the epics Prince Arthur and King Arthur, written by Richard Blackmore, feature Arthur as an allegory for the struggles that William III faced against James II. The story of Tom Thumb, which was initially told through chapbooks and later through the political plays of Henry Fielding, appears to have been the most popular Arthurian story during this time period. Although the action is clearly set in Arthurian Britain, the treatment is humorous. and Arthur appears to be a primarily comedic version of his romance character while the story is being told. Henry Purcell's music is largely responsible for the continued performance of John Dryden's masque King Arthur, although it is rarely performed in its original form. Medievalism, Romanticism, and the Gothic revival all contributed to a resurgence of interest in Arthur and the medieval romances right at the beginning of the 19th century. The chivalric ideals that were exemplified in the Arthur of Romance served as the basis for the development of a new code of ethics for gentlemen in the 19th century. This resurgence of interest was first observed in the year 1816, when Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur was reprinted for the very first time since the year 1634. In the beginning, the Arthurian legends from the Middle Ages were of particular interest to poets. For instance, William Wordsworth was inspired to write The Egyptian Maid, which is an allegory of the Holy Grail. Alfred Tennyson, whose first Arthurian poem, known as The Lady of Shalott, was published in 1832, was the most prominent of these poets. Following in the footsteps of the medieval romance genre, Arthur himself appeared in a few of these works at a relatively minor level. However, Tennyson's Arthurian work reached its pinnacle of popularity with Idylls of the King, which reworked the entire narrative of Arthur's life for the Victorian era. This was the work that brought Tennyson the most fame. The book was initially released in 1859, and within the first week of its publication, it sold 10,000 copies. Arthur, the protagonist of the Idylls, became a symbol of ideal manhood when he was ultimately unsuccessful in his attempt to establish a perfect kingdom on earth due to the limitations of human nature. The works of Tennyson inspired a large number of imitators, sparked a significant amount of public interest in the legends of Arthur and the character himself, and made Malory's stories accessible to a more extensive audience through their dissemination. Although the first modernization of Malory's great compilation of Arthur's tales was published in 1862, not long after the publication of Idylls, there were a total of 6 additional editions and 5 competitors before the century came to a close. This interest in the Arthur of Romance and the stories that were associated with him continued throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. It had an impact on poets like William Morris and pre-Raphaelite artists like Edward Burne-Jones. After the publication of Idylls, even the humorous story of Tom Thumb, which had been the primary manifestation of Arthur's legend in the 18th century, was rewritten. This was done in order to take into account the new information. Despite the fact that Tom remained a figure of comic relief and maintained his diminutive stature, his story now included more elements from the medieval Arthurian romances. Additionally, Arthur is treated more seriously and historically in these new versions of the story. The resurgence of the Arthurian romance was also influential in the United States. Books like Sidney Lanier's The Boy's King Arthur were able to reach a large number of readers and served as a source of inspiration for Mark Twain's satire, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. In some instances, the Arthur of Romance was at the center of these new Arthurian works, such as in Burne-Jones's The Sleep of Arthur in Avalon. However, in other instances, he reverted to his medieval status and was either marginalized or even completely absent. One notable example of the latter is Wagner's Arthurian opera, Parsifal, which is a notable example of the latter. As a further point of interest, the resurgence of interest in Arthur and the Arthurian stories did not continue unabated. It was primarily confined to pre-Raphaelite imitators by the time the 19th century came to a close, and it was unable to avoid being impacted by World War I, which harmed the reputation of chivalry and, as a result, interest in its medieval manifestations and Arthur as a chivalric role model. The Romance tradition, on the other hand, continued to be powerful enough to convince authors such as Thomas Hardy, Lawrence Binyon, and John Masefield to write plays based on the Arthurian legend. T.S. Eliot makes a reference to the Arthur myth in his poem The Waste Land, which also makes reference to the Fisher King. In the latter half of the 20th century, the influence of the Romance tradition of Arthur continued to be felt through the publication of novels such as T.H. White's The Once and Future King, Mary Stuart's The Crystal Cave and its 4 sequels, Thomas Berger's tragicomic Arthur Rex, and Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, as well as comic strips such as Prince Valiant. Tennyson had reworked the romance tales of Arthur to suit and comment upon the issues of his day. And, as is often the case with modern treatments as well, the same thing is often the case with modern treatments. Bradley's story takes a feminist approach to Arthur and his legend, in contrast to the narratives of Arthur that can be found in medieval materials. Mary Stuart's first 3 Arthurian novels feature the wizard Merlin as the main character, rather than Arthur himself. The Crystal Cave is narrated by Merlin in the first person from the perspective of Merlin. There is a common practice among American authors to rewrite the story of Arthur in order to make it more in line with principles such as democracy and equality. Arthur, the Emperor of Britain, is only a minor character in John Cowper Powys's Porreus, a romance of the Dark Ages, which is set in Wales in 499, just prior to the Saxon invasion. On the other hand, Myrddin, Merlin, and Ninue, Tennyson's Vivian, are major figures in the story. The disappearance of Myrddin at the conclusion of the book is described as occurs in the tradition of magical hibernation, when the king or mage leaves his people for some island or cave to return either at a more propitious or more dangerous time. The Holy Grail and the legend that Arthur is buried at Glastonbury are both topics that are addressed in Powys's earlier novel, A Glastonbury Romance, which was published in 1932. The love affair. Additionally, Arthur has gained popularity in the film and theater industries. Both the Lerner and Loewe stage musical Camelot and Walt Disney's animated film The Sword in the Stone were adapted from the novel written by T.H. White. Camelot, which focuses on the love between Lancelot and Guinevere, as well as the cuckolding of Arthur, was also adapted into a film with the same name in 1967. The Arthurian romance tradition is particularly evident, and in films that have received critical acclaim, such as Robert Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, Eric Rohmer's Perceval le Gallois, and John Boorman's Excalibur. Additionally, it is the primary source of the material that was used in the Arthurian spoof, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In the modern legend of King Arthur, retellings and reimaginings of the romance tradition are not the only important aspect of the story. In addition, there have been attempts made to portray Arthur as a genuine historical figure from around the year 500, removing the romance from the characters. This recent trend, which became dominant in Arthurian literature in the years following the outbreak of the Second World War, when Arthur's legendary resistance to Germanic enemies struck a chord in Britain, is a return to the medieval chronicle tradition of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Historia Brittonum, as Taylor and Brewer have pointed out. This is a relatively new trend. Clemence Dane's series of radio plays, The Saviors, used a historical Arthur to embody the spirit of heroic resistance against desperate odds. Robert Sheriff's play, The Long Sunset, saw Arthur rallying Romano-British resistance against the Germanic invaders. Both of these plays were performed in the United Kingdom. A similar trend toward situating Arthur in a historical setting can also be seen in historical and fantasy novels that were published during this time period. In addition, Arthur has been cited as an example of correct behavior in the modern era. During the 1930s, the Order of the Fellowship of the Knights of the Round Table was established in the United Kingdom with the purpose of advancing Christian principles and Arthurian concepts of chivalry during the medieval period. hundreds of thousands of young people, both male and female, joined Arthurian youth groups in the United States. These groups included the Knights of King Arthur, which promoted Arthur and his legends as virtuous examples of leadership. Nevertheless, the influence of Arthur in contemporary culture extends far beyond the realm of Arthurian endeavors, as evidenced by the fact that names associated with Arthur are frequently affixed to things, buildings, and locations. As the historian Norris J. Lacey has pointed out, the popular notion of Arthur appears to be limited, not surprisingly, to a few motifs and names, but there can be no doubt of the extent to which a legend born many centuries ago is profoundly embedded in modern culture at every level. Similarly to King Arthur, in Irish mythology, as well as in later Scottish and Manx folklore, Fionn mac Cumhail, who is also frequently anglicized as Finn McCool or McCool, is a hero. In addition to being a poet and a seer, he is the leader of the Fianna bands, which are comprised of young roving men who are hunters and warriors. According to legend, he possesses a magical thumb that bestows upon him a great deal of wisdom. Additionally, he is frequently depicted engaging in combat with his spear and sword, as well as hunting with his hounds Bran and Sceolang. The Fianna cycle, also known as the Fenian cycle, is comprised of the stories of Fionn and his Fiann. A significant portion of these tales are told by Oisin, Fionn's son, who is a poet. In the Old Irish language, Finn Find refers to white, bright, lustrous, fair, light-hued, fair, handsome, bright, blessed, in moral sense, fair, just, true. It is cognate with primitive Irish Vendo, which can be found in names from Ogham inscriptions. Welsh Gwyn, Cornish Gwen, Breton Gwen, Continental Celtic and Common Brittonic window, which is a common element in personal and place names, and it originates from the Proto-Celtic adjective masculine singular windows. The story of Fionn's birth and the early adventures he had are told in a number of different sources, including the narrative The Boyhood Deeds of Fionn. Cumhal, the leader of the Fianna, was the father of Fionn, who was born after his death by Muirn. Originally hailing from Leinster, Fionn and his father, Cumhal mac Trenmoir, also known as son of Trenmore, have their origins in the Uí Tarsig tribe, otherwise known as the descendants of Tairsiu. According to the Labor Gabala Eren, the Uí Tarsig are referred to as one of the three tribes that are descended from the Fir Bolg. Muirni Muinchayam, also known as of the Fair Neck, or of the Lovely Neck, or Muirin's Smooth Neck, was the daughter of Taj MacNuadat and the granddaughter of Nuadat, the druid who served Cathair Mór, who was the High King at the time. However, according to another source, she was described as the granddaughter of Nuadu of the Tuatha De Danann. She was described as having a smooth neck. At the time, Con Techethach, also known as of the 100 Battles, was still a regional king at Sanandos, which is located in Kells, County Meath. Cumhal served him. Muirn was kidnapped by Cumhal after her father turned down his request for her hand in marriage. Tag made a request to the High King Con, who then made Cumhal illegal. Con and Cumhal engaged in combat during the Battle of Cnúcha. Subsequently, Gol mac Morna, who had assumed leadership of the Fianna, was responsible for the death of Cumhal. The Fianna were a group of warriors who were also known as a military order. They were primarily made up of members of two clans that were in conflict with one another. Clan Basna, which Fionn and Cumhal belonged to, and Clan Morna, which Gol mac Morna belonged to. The Fenians were supposed to be devoted to serving the High King and to warding off foreign invaders. They were also supposed to resist foreign invasions. Gol mac Morna succeeded Cumhal as the leader of the Fianna after Cumhal's death, and he remained in that role for a period of 10 years. She was already pregnant when her father rejected her and ordered his people to burn her. But Khan would not allow it, and instead placed her under the protection of Fiakal mac Conchin, whose wife, Bodmal the Druid, was Cumhal's sister. Muireann was already pregnant when her father rejected her. Muireann gave birth to a son in Fiakal's house, and she named him Daemna, which literally means sureness or certainty. Daemna is also a name that refers to a young male deer. Several legends explain that he was given the name Fionn because his hair turned prematurely white. The Gaul, the sons of Morna, and other men were on the lookout for Fionn and his brother Tulcha mac Cumhal. They were being pursued by these individuals. Consequently, Finn was taken away from his mother Muireann and placed in the care of Bodmal and the woman Liath Luashra, also known as the Grey of Luashra. They raised him in secret in the forest of Sliav Bladma, where they instructed him in the skills of hunting and warfare. Finn learned how to hunt after he turned 6 years old, but he still had a reason to run away from Morna's sons on multiple occasions. As he grew older, he entered the service of a number of local kings under the guise of a non-existent identity. However, when each of these kings recognized Fionn as Cumhal's son, they all told him to leave because they were afraid that they would not be able to protect him from his adversaries. Fionn was an avid hunter who frequently went on hunts with Na Fianna on the Hill of Allen in County Kildare. Many people in the region believe that Fionn was the first person to successfully catch the salmon of knowledge in the River Slate, which flows through Ballyteague. After that, the key to his success in catching fish of knowledge was to always cast from the Ballyteague side of a river. This was the secret to his success. Following his consumption of a particular salmon, which was believed to be the salmon of wisdom, he acquired what commentators have referred to as the thumb of knowledge. A description of this can be found in the book titled The Boyhood Deeds of Fionn. Young Fionn, who was still known by his boyhood name Demna, came into contact with the poet Finn Esses near the Boyne River and continued his education under him. It was a prophecy that the poet would consume this salmon, and nothing would remain unknown to him. Finnegas had spent 7 years trying to catch the salmon that lived in Feck's Pool of the Boyne. This was because it was believed that the poet would consume this salmon. Even though this particular salmon is not specifically referred to as the salmon of knowledge, or anything similar in the text, it is presumed to be the one that consumed the nut of knowledge at the well of Sagais. After some time, the poet was able to catch it, and he instructed the boy to prepare it for him. While he was preparing it, Demon accidentally burned his thumb and put it in his mouth. He did this out of simple curiosity. Because of this, he was endowed with the wisdom of the salmon, and when Esses observed that the youngster had acquired wisdom, he presented the youngster with the entire salmon to consume, and he also gave Demne the new name, Fionn. Following that, the information that he desired to acquire was revealed to him whenever he recited the Taim Lida with his thumb in his mouth. Fionn was able to call upon the ability of the Thumb of Knowledge subsequent to the events that transpired in his life, and as a result, he was able to determine how to exact revenge against Gol, an ability that is referred to as the Tooth of Wisdom or Tooth of Knowledge can be found in the Akalam na Senyorach. The acquisition of the Thumb of Knowledge by Fionn has been compared to the tasting of the Cauldron of Knowledge by the Welsh Gwion Bach and the tasting of Fafnir's heart by Sigurdur Fafnisbani. According to the Akalam na Senorach, Fionn accomplished a remarkable feat when he was only 10 years old. He was able to kill Eilen, the fire-breathing man of the Tuatha De Danann. This man had been wreaking havoc on the Irish capital of Tara every year during the festival of Samhain for the past 23 years. He had lulled the men of the city to sleep with his music, and then he set fire to the city and all of its treasures. Fionn offered his services as a volunteer in response to the King of Ireland's inquiry regarding the defenders of Tara against Island's invasion. Fionn was able to acquire a unique spear known as the Birga from Fiacha Mac Congha, also known as the Son of Conga. This spear was designed to protect against the sleep-inducing music of Island's dulcimer when it was unsheathed, and the bare steel blade was pressed against the forehead or another part of the body. The Fiacha in question had been one of Kumal's men in the past, but he was now working for the High Leader. Following the successful defeat of Island and the subsequent rescue of Tara, Fionn's heritage was acknowledged, and he was granted command of the Fianna. Gaul, however, resigned from his position and became a devoted follower of Fionn. Despite the fact that a disagreement between the clans had arisen in the future regarding the Slanga pig, before Fionn accomplished the feat of defeating the firebrand of the Fairy Mound and defending Tara, he was referred to as a marauder and an outlaw when he was 10 years old, according to the description. It is also stated in other places that when Fionn grew up to become capable of committing plunder on everyone who was an enemy, he went to his maternal grandfather Taj to demand compensation for the death of his father, on the condition that he engage in single combat. Tag acceded to his demand by giving up the estate of Almu, which is the Hill of Allen in the present day. Fionn was also compensated by Gol Macmorna for his services. Fionn was out hunting when he first met Sadba, who would later become his most famous wife. The druid, Fyr Doirich, whom she had refused to marry, had transformed her into a deer. She had been transformed into a deer. Bran and Seolang, Fionn's hounds, who were born from a human being who had been enchanted into the form of a hound, recognized her as a human being, and Fionn later brought her back to his home. Upon entering Fionn's territory, she underwent a transformation that allowed her to revert back to her female form. This was the only location where she could regain her true form. She and Fionn tied the knot, and she became pregnant not long after. During the time that Fionn was away providing protection for his nation, Fyr Doirich, whose name literally translates to Dark Man, came back and transformed her into a deer, after which she disappeared. Fionn spent a significant amount of time looking for her, but to no avail. Once again engaged in the act of hunting, Bran and Skolang discovered her son, Oisin, in the form of a fawn. He underwent a transformation into a child and went on to become one of the most powerful members of the Fianna. At the wedding feast, Gran falls in love with one of the Fianna, Diarmuid Ua Duibne, who is known for his beauty. This occurs in the story The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grain, in which the High King Cormac Mac Airt makes a promise to the elderly Fionn that he will give him his daughter, Grain. As Fionn pursues them, she coerces him into fleeing with her, despite his resistance. Along with the assistance of the Fianna, the god Angus, who is Diarmuid's foster father, the lovers receive assistance. In the end, Fionn is able to reconcile his differences with the couple. In spite of this, Fionn invites Diarmuid to go on a boar hunt many years later, and Diarmuid ends up getting gored. The water that Fionn drinks from his hands has the ability to heal, but before he returns to Diarmuid, he always makes sure to let the water run through his fingers while he is gathering it. Fionn is humiliated by his grandson Oscar, but by the time their grandson finally returns with water, it is too late. Diarmuid has already passed away. One of the most widely accepted interpretations of Fionn's demise is that he is not actually dead at all. Rather, he is said to be sleeping in a cave while being surrounded by the Fianna. One day, he will come to his senses and defend Ireland when she is in the most dire of circumstances. It is said that he will emerge when the Dord Fiann, which is the hunting horn of the Fianna, is sounded 3 times, and that he will be as powerful and as well as he has ever been. This is according to one account. Fionn is credited with the creation of a great number of Ireland's geographical features. In order to avoid getting his feet wet, he is said to have constructed the Giant's Causeway as stepping stones to Scotland. In addition, he is said to have once scooped up a portion of Ireland in order to throw it at a competitor, but it missed and landed in the Irish Sea. The clump became the Isle of Man, the pebble became Rockall, and the void became Lough Neagh. Ailsa Craig, a small islet located just off the coast of the county in question, is said to be another rock that was thrown at the fleeing Benandonere, according to a common myth that circulates in Ayrshire, Scotland. The term Paddy's Milestone is sometimes used to refer to the islet in the county of Ayrshire. In addition, Fingal's Cave in Scotland is named after him, and it is similar to the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland in that it is composed of hexagonal basalt columns. Fionn Mac Cumhaill, also referred to as Finn McCool or Finn MacCool, is depicted as a benevolent and magical giant in popular folklore from both Ireland and Manx. Fionn is told that the giant Benandonor is coming to fight him one day while he is making a pathway in the sea towards Scotland, which is known as the Giant's Causeway. This is the most famous story that is associated with this version of Fionn. Knowing that he is unable to stand up to the enormous Benandonere, Fionn approaches his wife Una and asks for her assistance. In order to conceal her husband, she first disguises him as a baby and places him in a cradle. She then prepares a batch of griddle cakes and conceals griddle irons within some of them. Upon Benandonere's arrival, Una informs him that Fionn is absent, but will return in a short space of time. During the time that Benandonere is waiting, he is attempting to intimidate Una by using his enormous power to break rocks with his little finger. After that, Una presents Benandonere with a griddle cake. However, when he bites into the iron, he begins to chip his teeth. He is reprimanded by Una for being weak, and she gives the baby a drink that does not contain an iron. The baby consumes it without any difficulty. Benandonere is so impressed by the size of the baby and the power of the baby's teeth in the Irish version that, at Una's instigation, he puts his fingers in Fionn's mouth to feel how sharp his teeth are. This is because Benandonere is so thrilled by the size of the baby. After Fionn bites Benandonere's little finger, Benandonere sprints back towards Scotland across the causeway, smashing the causeway so that Fionn is unable to follow him. Benandonere is terrified of the possibility of meeting his father because of the size of the baby. An additional account of the battle that took place at Kirk Christ Rushen between Fionn and the Bugain can be found in the Manx Gaelic version. Fionn's feet were responsible for carving out the channel that connected Kitterland and the Calf of Man. The other foot carved out the channel that connected Kitterland and the Isle of Man. Additionally, the feet of the Buggin were responsible for opening up Port Erin. Although Fionn was injured by the Buggin, he managed to escape over the water. However, as he was running away, the Buggin tore out one of his own teeth and struck Fionn repeatedly. The tooth was accidentally dropped into the water, where it eventually became known as the Chicken Rock. Fionn cursed the tooth and explained why it is a risk to sailors. A distinct nationalistic connotation is attached to the phrase Fingal's Rising when it is discussed in Newfoundland and in certain regions of Nova Scotia. To speak of Fingal, as his name is pronounced in English as opposed to Fionn MacCool in Newfoundland Irish, is sometimes used as a stand-in for Newfoundland or its culture. This is because his name became popular in songs as well as in bars. Folk tales that involve the hero Finn MacCool are considered to be classified in the Arnie Thompson Uther Index as ATU 369, which is referred to as the youth on a quest for his lost father. This type of tale is considered by some to be unique to South Asian tradition, specifically India. Geoffrey Keating, a historian who lived in the 17th century, and a number of Irish scholars who lived in the 19th century, were of the opinion that Fionn was modeled after a historical figure. Heinrich Zimmer, a scholar who lived in the 19th century, proposed that Fionn and the Fenian cycle originated from the Norse Gaels' cultural heritage. It was suggested by him that the name Fianna was an Irish translation of the Old Norse word Fiandr, which means enemies, and ranges from brave enemies to brave warriors. Another thing that he mentioned was that the story of Fionn's Thumb of Knowledge is comparable to the Norse story of Sigurdur and Fafnir, despite the fact that other cultures also have stories that are comparable to this one. Ketil Find, a Norseman who lived in Munster and had a Norse forename, Ketil, and an Irish nickname, Find, the Fair, or the White, was the subject of Zimmer's speculation that Fionn could be considered a possible inspiration. However, Ketil's father must have also had a Norse name, and it is highly unlikely that he was named Kumal. As a result, George Henderson did not accept the proposal. It is said that Fionn mac Cumhail comes from Ballyfin, which is located in the county of Lough. The phrase, town of Fionn, is the literal translation of the Irish word Ballyfin onto the English language. In James Macpherson's poem cycle, Ossian, which Macpherson claimed was translated from discovered Ossianic poetry written in the Scottish Gaelic language, Fionn mac Cumhail was transformed into the character Fingal. Macpherson had claimed that the poem cycle was a translation of the literary work. The name Fingal, which is derived from the Gaelic word Fionghol, may have been Macpherson's rendering of Fionn's name as Fingal, due to a misunderstanding of the different forms that Fionn can take. However, there was controversy from the beginning regarding Macpherson's claims that he translated the works from ancient sources. His poems had a wide-ranging influence on writers, ranging from the young Walter Scott to Goethe. Although it is possible that the poems were based on fragments of Gaelic legend, the authenticity of the poems is now generally questioned. The controversy has, to some extent, obscured the significant literary merit of the poems, as well as their influence on Romanticism. The works of Fionn mac Cumhail are prominently featured in contemporary Irish literature. Most notably, he makes multiple appearances in James Joyce's novel, Finnegan's Wake. Some people have suggested that the title, which is derived from the street ballad Finnegan's Wake, may also be a combination of the phrase, Finn again is awake, which refers to his eventual awakening to defend Ireland. There are also passages in Flann O'Brien's comic novel, At Swim Two Birds, that parody the style of Irish myths, and Fionn is one of the characters that appears in those passages. The book titled Finn mac Cool, written by Morgan Llewellyn, recounts the romances that occur throughout Fionn's life, including his rise to the position of leader of the Fianna. The band Dropkick Murphys, who are based in Boston, have a song called The Legend of Finn mac Cumhail that is included on their album titled Sing Loud Sing Proud. This song is a celebration of the character, an account of a legendary battle between Fionn mac Cumhail, who is said to have lived in Glencoe, in Scotland, for a period of time, and a Viking host in 40 longships that sailed up the Narrows by Ballachulish into Loch Leven, can be found in the book Glencoe, the story of the massacre, written by John Preble. It was the Fane of the Glencoe Valley who were successful in defeating the Norsemen, and Gall MacMorna was the one who took the life of their chief in the process. In the year 1969, Rosemary Sutcliffe released her children's novel, The High Deeds of Finn McCool, which is a highly evocative piece of literature. A book titled Finn mac Cool was published in 1994 and was written by Morgan Llewellyn, an American author. The fictional book provides a vivid account of the historical adventures that Finn undertakes, which are replete with myth and magic. An exiled childhood, the love and loss of his beloved wife and child, and his legendary rise from a low-class slave to the leader of the unbeatable Fianna, are all things that he experienced during his life. Finn McCool is a character that appears in The Long War, which was written by Terry Pratchett and Steve Baxter. The Final Fighting of Fionn mac Cumhaill is a novella written by Randall Garrett that delves into the adventures that Fionn mac Cumhaill has after he has passed away. In the book titled "'Tis Himself, The Tale of Finn McCool," written by Maggie Brace, the author delves into the early childhood and education of Finn, similar to King Arthur and Finn mac Cumhaill, as a popular character in the chivalric romance tradition of the Arthurian legend, Lancelot du Lac, which is French for Lancelot of the Lake, and can also be written as Launcelot and other variants, is a character that is frequently used. In most depictions, he is portrayed as King Arthur's close companion and as one of the most powerful knights of the Round Table. In addition, he is portrayed as a secret lover of Guinevere, who is King Arthur's wife. As depicted in his most prominent and comprehensive portrayal, Lancelot is portrayed as a stunning orphaned son of King Ban, who ruled the ancient kingdom of Benoic. Before he joined Arthur's court as a young knight and learned about his roots, he was brought up in a fairy realm by the Lady of the Lake. During this time, he was unaware of his true parentage. As a result of his heroic performance in a multitude of battles, quests, and tournaments, as well as his reputation as a swordsman and jouster who is nearly unrivaled, Lancelot quickly ascends to the position of Lord of the Castle Joyous Guard and becomes the personal champion of Queen Guinevere, to whom he is completely. Additionally, he develops a close relationship with Galahad and continues to suffer from fits of violent rage and other forms of insanity on a regular basis, sometimes for extensive periods of time. As a result of Lady Elaine's use of magic to entice him, their son Galahad, who is devoid of his father's character flaws, becomes the ideal knight. He is successful in completing the most difficult of all quests, which is to obtain the Holy Grail, when Lancelot himself is unsuccessful as a result of his sins. The adulterous affair that Lancelot had with Guinevere is eventually brought to light, which leads to the outbreak of a bloody civil war. This conflict, which is eventually exploited by Mordred, ultimately results in the destruction of Arthur's kingdom. In the French poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, written by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century, Lancelot makes his first notable appearance as the main character. The poem already focuses on his courtly love for Guinevere. On the other hand, another early poem by Lancelot, titled Lanzelet, which was a German translation of an unidentified French book, did not contain such a motif. Furthermore, the connections between the two texts and their possible shared source are not entirely clear. Later on, Chrétien's story was expanded upon in other works of Arthurian romance, particularly through the extensive Lancelot Grail prose cycle, which presented the now familiar version of his legend after its abridged retelling in Le Morte d'Arthur. This was especially true in the case of the Lancelot Grail prose cycle. Lancelot, a character who is both loyal and treasonous, has remained very popular over the course of several centuries and is frequently reimagined by contemporary authors. There are numerous hypotheses that have been proposed concerning the origins of Lancelot as a character in an Arthurian romance play. In those postulated by Ferdinand Lot and Roger Sherman Loomis, Lancelot's figure is related to Lenliog, an Irishman in the early Arthurian Welsh tale Colush and Olwen, which associates him with the headland of Gannon, and the Welsh hero Loch Lowinaog, most likely a version of the euhemerized Irish deity Lug Lonbemnech, with Lobiac, meaning lake in Welsh, possibly via a now-forgotten epithet such as Lamcalad, suggesting that they are the same figure. Their similarities beyond the name include wielding a sword and fighting for a cauldron in Culhwch and Prediu Anwen. In addition, Loomis connected Lancelot to the Welsh mythological hero Llew Law Gyffes. T. Gwyn Jones, on the other hand, asserted that there were connections between Lancelot and Eliwlad, who was a nephew of Arthur in the English legend. Proponents of the Scythian origins of the Arthurian legend have hypothesized that an early form of the legend could have been Alanus Alot, which translates to Alan of the River Lot. Those who are looking for clues in classical antiquity see elements of Lancelot in the ancient Greek mythical figures of Aeschylus and Moxus. Alfred Anscombe, in the year 1913, put forth the idea that the name Lancelot originated from the Germanic word Vlancloth, which has its origins in the Old English words Wlenseo, pride, and Loda, cloak. This idea was connected to Vinovyloth, the name of a Gothic chief or tribe that was mentioned in the Getica of the 6th century. According to more recent authors, such as Norma Lore Goodrich, the name may have been derived from Geoffrey of Monmouth's character Angusilaus, which was probably a Latinized name of Unguist, the name of a son of the 5th century Pictish king Forgus. When translated from Geoffrey's Latin into Old French, it would become Ancelaus. Chrétien de Troyes, a French poet who lived in the 12th century, is credited with having invented the name. Other figures from the 6th century who have been suggested as potential candidates for the prototype of Lancelot include the early French Saint Frambo de Lasse, Maelgwyn, king of Gwynedd, and Laenaog, father of Gwalog, king of Elmet. All of these individuals were born in the 6th century. It is possible that Lancelot was the protagonist of a well-known folk tale that was initially independent but was eventually incorporated into the Arthurian tradition. The thievery of an infant by a water fairy, the appearance of the hero at a tournament on 3 consecutive days in 3 different disguises, and the rescue of a queen or princess from an otherworld prison are all characteristics of a well-known and widespread tale. Variations of this tale can be found in numerous examples collected by Théodore Hussard de la Villemarqué in his Barzaz Braise, by Emmanuel Cosquin in his Contes Lorrains, and by John Francis Campbell in his Tales of the West Highlands. Both of these authors have collected examples of the story. Regarding his name, it is possible that Lancelot is a variation of the French name Lancelin, which most likely means javelin in Old French. This idea was initially proposed by Gaston Paris in the year 1881, and Rachel Bromwich later contributed to its acceptance. It is also possible that it is derived from the Old French word lancelot, which means servant. The hypothesis was initially proposed by de la Villemarqué in 1842. The name Lancelot is actually written in this manner in a number of different manuscripts. In addition to this, it is reminiscent of a rare Saxon name called Wolank, which means the proud one. Stephen Pow has recently proposed that the name Lancelot is an Old French pronunciation of the Hungarian word Laszlo, Ladislaus, which was derived from the historical figure of King Ladislaus III of Hungary. Through Margaret of France, whom he married in 1186, King Bela III of Hungary was working toward the canonization of Ladislaus as a saint and establishing a marriage alliance with France. Both of these endeavors took place in the early 1280s. As a result of the fact that Margaret was the half-sister of Marie de Champagne, who was Chrétien's patroness, the introduction of Lancelot would have been intended to pay tribute to the Hungarian king around the time that he was getting married to a member of the French royal house. Chrétien de Troyes' Old French poem, Eric and Enide, 1170, is the earliest known work that features Lancelot as a character. In this poem, Lancelot's name appears third on a list of knights at King Arthur's court. Although he did not play a significant role in Chrétien's story, the fact that his name comes after Gawain and Eric is an indication of the presumed importance of the knight at court. Lancelot makes a comeback in Chrétien's Cleges, where he plays a more significant role as one of the knights that Cligès must defeat in order to complete his quest. However, it is not until Chrétien's Lancelot, the Knight of the Car, Le Chevalier de la Charrette, that he is given the full name Lancelot du Lac, Lancelot of the Lake, which was later adopted by the French authors of the Lancelot Grail and then by Thomas Malory. This is the first time that he is portrayed as the protagonist. Chrétien treats Lancelot as if his audience was already familiar with the character's history. However, the majority of the traits and deeds that are commonly associated with Lancelot today are only mentioned for the first time in this passage. The story tells of Lancelot's irrational love for Queen Guinevere, who is married to King Arthur. The story culminates in Lancelot's rescue of Queen Guinevere after she is kidnapped by Prince Meleagant, who is also in love with her, but his feelings for her are completely unrequited. It takes place in the otherworldly and dangerous land of Gora. According to Matilda Bruckner's interpretation, what existed before Chrétien remains uncertain, but there is no doubt that his version became the starting point for all subsequent tales of Lancelot as the knight whose extraordinary prowess is inextricably linked to his love for Arthur's queen. In accordance with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the character of Lancelot, as imagined by Chrétien, is a superb image of the courtly lover, pushing the love he bears for his lady to the point of exaltation and ecstasy. Governed by love, Lancelot no longer knows how to see the world around him. He no longer knows who he is. On the lyrical model of the astonished lover, paralyzed by his love and losing all his faculties while thinking of his lady, Chrétien makes Lancelot a knight who is entirely taken by his passion for the queen. Overwhelmed by desire, he repeatedly forgets the reality around him. The knight is ready for his lady to suffer the wounds that make him a martyr of love, just as Christ is a martyr of God. The lady here becomes the idol to which the knight worships. Lancelot bows before the bed where the queen awaits him as before an altar, remaining in adoration as before a holy relic in which he places all his faith. The night of love between Lancelot and Guinevere is then evoked as a feast for all the senses and as an indescribable joy, greater and deeper than that known to all other lovers. But the separation, when day breaks, revives the suffering of the knight who leaves in despair. The body departs, but the heart remains. Lanzelet is a Middle High German epic poem written by Ulrich von Zatzikoven and dating back to the very end of the 12th century, no earlier than 1194. However, the love that Lancelot had for Guinevere is completely absent from this early work. According to Ulrich, his poem is a translation of an earlier work that was taken from a French book that he had obtained. He assures the reader that there is nothing left out or added compared to what the French book tells. He describes his source as having been written by a certain Arnaud Daniel in the Provençal dialect, and he believes that it must have been significantly different from Chrétien's story in a number of different circumstances. In the novel Lanzelet, the person who kidnaps Guinevere, is referred to as King Valorin. In contrast to Chrétien's Meleagant, the name of King Valorin does not appear to originate from the Welsh Melwas. To add insult to injury, Lanzelet is not the one who comes to Guinevere's rescue. Rather, he is the one who ultimately finds happiness in marriage to the fairy Princess Iblis. In the book, Lancelot is the nephew of King Arthur. He is the son of Queen Clarine, who is also the nephew of King Arthur. King Pant of Genois, Lancelot's father, was killed in a rebellion. A fairy is responsible for Lanzelet's upbringing, just like she was in Chrétien's version. Her role as the aquatic queen of the Maidenland is elaborated upon here, and she serves as the inspiration for a significant portion of his early adventures. The idea that Lancelot was the protagonist of a story that existed prior to the love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot has been put forward. This story may have been very similar to Ulrich's interpretation of the story. If this is the case, then the motif of adultery could have been created by Chrétien for his Chevalier de la Charette, or it could have been present in the source that was provided to him by Marie de Champagne, his patroness, who was known for her keen interest in matters relating to courtly love. However, the source has since been lost. The poem was abandoned by Chrétien himself for reasons that are unknown, possibly due to his personal distaste for the subject matter. Chrétien then handed the poem over to his associate, Godefroy de Lagny, who completed it. Within the context of the Old French prose, Romance Vulgate cycle, also referred to as the Lancelot Grail. The character of Lancelot was further developed during the early 13th century. There he makes a significant appearance in the later parts of the work, which are referred to as the Questa del Saint Graal, the quest for the Holy Grail, the Mort Arthur, the death of Arthur, and the Lancelot en prose, Prose Lancelot. The only thing that Chrétien de Troyes was interested in when he wrote at the request of Countess Marie was the romantic relationship that existed between Lancelot and the Queen. On the other hand, the prose Lancelot significantly expands the story by assigning him a family, letting him descend from a lost kingdom, and providing him with a number of additional adventures. Gaston Paris argued that the Guinevere Meleagant episode of the prose Lancelot is an almost literal adaptation of Chrétien's poem. The theme of courtly love in the poem appeared to be forced on the unwilling Chrétien by Marie, despite the fact that it can be seen as a significant amount of amplification. Soon after, a significant portion of the prose Lancelot material that was included in the Vulgate cycle was removed in the rewriting that is now known as the Post-Vulgate cycle. In this rewriting, Lancelot is no longer the primary protagonist, and the parts that were left over were rewritten and attached to the other parts of this cycle. The character of Lancelot is frequently associated with the religiously Christian themes that are prevalent in the Arthurian romance genre. A parallel can be drawn between his search for Guinevere in Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, and Christ's search for the truth about the human soul. It is described that he effortlessly lifts the lid off the sarcophagus, which bears an inscription that foretells his liberation of the captives. His adventure among the tombs is described in terms that suggest Christ's harrowing of hell and resurrection. Chrétien did not include Lancelot in his final romance, which was an unfinished version of Perceval, Le Conte de Graal, Perceval, or the Story of the Grail, which was the first piece of medieval literature to feature the Grail motif. Lancelot would go on to become one of the most prominent knights associated with the search for the Holy Grail. In Chrétien's treatment, Perceval is the only person who is looking for the Holy Grail. The first time that Lancelot is mentioned in connection with the Holy Grail quest is in the prose romance Perlesvaud, which was written between the years 1200 and 1210. The tradition of the Vulgate cycle, which was inspired by Robert de Boron, provides Lancelot with a biblical lineage, including King David and King Solomon, as among his ancient ancestors. However, due to his sins, Lancelot is unable to complete the Grail quest. Romance from Germany. For example, Dieu Crone bestows upon Lancelot the characteristics of a solar deity-type hero, causing his strength to reach its peak at high noon. This is a trait that is typically associated with Gawain. The so-called Lancelot compilation, which was written in Middle Dutch, is comprised of 7 Arthurian romances, one of which is a new Lancelot romance, which are distributed across the 3 parts of the cycle. This new interpretation of a romance involving Lancelot in the Netherlands demonstrates that the character is popular in a wide variety of contexts, apart from the Lancelot Grail cycle on its own. In this tale, which is titled Lancelot and the Hart with the White Foot, also known as Lancelot and the Hart with the White Foot, The protagonist engages in a battle against 7 lions in order to acquire the Whitefoot from a deer, which will enable him to marry a princess. A departure from the preceding English tradition, in which Gawain had been the most prominent figure, Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which was written near the end of the 15th century, followed the Lancelot Grail in presenting Lancelot as the best knight. In the later works that continue Chrétien's story, the forbidden love affair that occurs between Lancelot and Guinevere can be seen as a parallel to the love affair that occurs between Tristan and Isolde. In the end, Lancelot is identified with the tragedy of chance and human failing that is responsible for the downfall of the Round Table. The various daughters of the ancient knight Lionel and the fairy queen Blanchette are actually the ancestors of both Lancelot and Guinevere, in addition to Tristan, according to the story of Perceforest. According to the Vulgate cycle, Lancelot is born in the borderland between Gaul and Brittany as Galahad. Galahad was originally written as Galad or Galaz, and it is important to note that he is not to be confused with his own son, who shares the same name. Galahad was the son of King Ban of Benwick, who was a Gallo-Roman ruler. The English word Benwick corresponds to the eastern part of Anjou. Ban's kingdom has just been conquered by his adversary, King Clodas, and the mortally wounded king and his wife, Queen Elaine, are forced to flee the destruction of their final stronghold of Trèbes or Trèbes, which is most likely the historic Trèves castle in today's Chenhute-Trèves-Cunot, while carrying the infant child with them. While Elaine is tending to her dying husband, Lancelot is taken away by a fairy enchantress who is known as the Lady of the Lake. Elaine, who is still alive, will eventually become a Christian and become a nun. A different version of the story is told in the Italian novel La Tavola Ritonda. In this version, Lancelot is born when the late Ban's wife Costanza gives birth to him 2 months earlier than expected. Shortly after that, she also passes away. The child is then brought up in the magical realm that the lady possesses. It is because of his upbringing that he is given the name Du Lac, which literally translates to "of the lake." After 3 years of living in the human world, the child Lancelot grows up and matures much more quickly than he would normally happen to do. His double cousins Lionel and Bors the Younger, who are the sons of King Bors of Gaul and Yvain, Elaine's sister, are initially abducted by a knight of Claudas. Subsequently, they are spirited away to the Lady of the Lake to become Lancelot's junior companions. Among the other notable surviving relatives of Lancelot, Bleobaris de Ganis and Hector de Maris are frequently mentioned, along with a number of other relatives who are typically more distant. Some of their sons, such as Elien the White and Lancelot's own son, will also be present at the Round Table, along with a significant number of them. All of the individuals mentioned above will also be present at the Round Table. In the prose version of Lancelot, the knights of the Round Table that are mentioned as being related to Lancelot in some way or another include Aubin, Akantan, the Agile, Benin, Blamer, Brandiner, Crenides the Black, Denubra the Brave, Gadrin, Hebes the Famous, Lelas, Ocursus the Black, Pincados, Tanri, and a number of other knights of the Round Table, although they are different and fewer in Malory. According to a translation by Norris J. Lacey, an early section of the Vulgate Lancelot also provides a detailed description of the characteristics that made him the most handsome lad in the land. These characteristics include the feminine qualities of his hands and neck, as well as the ample amount of musculature that he possessed. The narration then adds the first mention of Lancelot's mental instability, which was not explicitly stated in Chrétien's version of the story. Chrétien's version of Lancelot is notable for his unwavering determination to rescue Guinevere, leaping into danger without thinking and ignoring wounds and pain. In particular, the narration emphasizes his propensity to to engage in a combat frenzy that is reminiscent of a berserk. His eyes were bright and smiling and full of delight as long as he was in a good mood. But when he was angry, they looked just like glowing coals, and it seemed that drops of red blood stood out from his cheekbones. He would snort like an angry horse and clench and grind his teeth, and it seemed that the breath coming out of his mouth was all red. Then he would shout like a trumpet in battle, and whatever he had his teeth in or was gripping in his hands, he would pull to pieces. In short, when he was in a rage, he had no sense or awareness of anything else, and this became apparent on many an occasion. Initially, the young Lancelot was only known as the nameless White Knight, Chevalier Blanc, and he was dressed in silver steel and mounted on a white horse. He claimed to be 18 years old, but it was later revealed that he was actually only 15 years old. The young Lancelot arrived in Arthur's kingdom of Logres with the Lady of the Lake in order to be knighted by the king at her request. The lady bestows upon him a potent magic ring that is capable of dispelling any enchantment. This is something that his unnamed fairy foster mother also does in Credian's version. Later parts of the Vulgate Lancelot instead retcon this as something that Guinevere bestows upon him. A lance, a sword, a tent, and a mirror are some of the other enchanted items that she gives to Lancelot. She also gives him numerous other items that have various magical abilities. Throughout the entirety of the Vulgate Lancelot, the lady, or her damsels, continue to provide assistance to him. After discovering his true identity, he eventually takes on the name of his grandfather, King Lancelot. Following his successful rescue of Gawain, King Arthur's nephew, from captivity in the episode titled The Dolorous Tower, Lancelot is eventually persuaded to join the prestigious Order of the Round Table, which is a part of King Arthur's royal order. After that, he winds up becoming one of Arthur's closest and most trusted friends, as well as his most formidable knight. As a result, he plays a pivotal role in the conflict against the Saxons in Lothian, Scotland, as he once again saves Gawain and Arthur himself from Castle Saxon Rock, and he also manages to capture Camille, the witch princess of the Saxons. He saves the kingdom of Arthur from being conquered by the half-giant Galho and convinces Galho to join Arthur. He does this all by himself. Additionally, Mallory has his Lancelot act as one of the chief leaders in Arthur's Roman War, including personally saving the wounded Bedivere during the final battle against Emperor Lucius. This is an expansion on the account that is found in the alliterative Morte Arthur. The Roman episode actually takes place within Mallory's Book 2, not before Book 3, which tells the story of Lancelot's youth. This is due to the fact that a significant portion of Le Morte was not written in chronological order. A strange magical connection between Lancelot and the young Queen Guinevere causes them to fall in love almost immediately after his arrival. One of Lancelot's adventures in the prose cycles involves rescuing Guinevere from being kidnapped by Maleagant, who is Arthur's adversary. Different sources provide different information regarding the precise timing and sequence of events, and certain sources are the only ones that contain certain details. As a matter of fact, the Maleagant episode was the final installment of the original, non-cyclic version of the prose Lancelot, prior to the later, significantly longer versions, which only detailed the hero's childhood and early youth. Guinevere, rather than King Arthur, is the one who awards him the title of Knight in the prose version of the story. In Mallory's abridged version of the story, which is found in Le Morte d'Arthur, the king is the one who performs the knighting of Lancelot. Additionally, the rescue of the queen from Meleagant and the physical consummation of their relationship are both delayed for a number of years. Sir Launcelot went to bede with the queen, and took no force of his hurty hond, but took his pleasaunce and his leakinge until hit was the dawning of the day, Mallory said, after he had broken through the iron bars of her prison chamber with his bare hands. Mallory recounted this sequence of events. The occurrence of this transgression occurs toward the end of Mallory's telling, after Lancelot has been unsuccessful in his quest for the Grail. In spite of this, just like in Mallory's French book source, his Lancelot, too, devotes himself to the service of Guinevere at an early stage in his story. A number of the initial knight-errant style adventures that Lancelot had from the Vulgate cycle did, in fact, make their way into Mallory's compilation. However, this is by no means accurate. These episodes include the defeat of the powerful villain Turquine, who had been holding several of Arthur's knights captive, as well as the slaying of a pair of giant knights. In the Vulgate, the locals then declare Lancelot their lord and attempt to convince him to stay with them. In addition to this, he emerges victorious from a number of tournaments, one of which was while he was competing on behalf of King Bagdemagus, one of the most well-known knights of the Round Table. Lancelot is even referred to as the best knight in the world in Mallory's very own episode of Sir Uri of Hungary. He is also a target of desire for a great number of women, beginning with the enormous Lady of Maelhout, when he is held captive by her at an early stage in the Vulgate Lancelot. An evil sorceress by the name of Heliwes desires him so fervently that she is unable to have him either dead or alive in Mallory's Chapel Perilous episode. As a result, she eventually passes away from her own sorrow. Elaine of Astolat, also known as the Lady of Shalott in modern times, similarly succumbs to heartbreak as a result of her unrequited love for Lancelot. She is the Demoiselle d'Escalot from the Vulgate. A mutual but purely platonic love develops between Lancelot and an avowed virgin maiden, whom Mallory refers to as Amable. The Vulgate does not name her because she is not mentioned in the Vulgate. Lancelot, operating under the guise of the Black Knight, on another occasion he also disguises himself as the Red Knight, plays a pivotal role in the conflict that is taking place between King Arthur and Prince Galahad, a powerful foreign invader. Galahad is on the verge of becoming the victor and conquering Arthur's kingdom. However, he is captivated by Lancelot's remarkable performance on the battlefield, and he offers him a boon in exchange for the privilege of spending one night in the bivouac for the privilege of being in his company. The boon is accepted by Lancelot, who then makes use of it to demand that Galahad surrender to Arthur in a peaceful manner. After that, Galahad becomes Lancelot's self-proclaimed vassal and the king's ally. Later on, after Lancelot finally joins the Round Table, Galahad joins the group themselves. The precise nature of Galahad's love for Lancelot is a topic of discussion among contemporary academics. Some scholars, for example, consider it to be an intimate friendship, while others consider it to be a love that is comparable to the love that exists between Lancelot and Guinevere. Galahad is completely preoccupied with how he can have Lancelot all to himself. Gawain makes the observation that Galahad is more possessive of Lancelot than any knight is of his lady. This is because he is publicly submissive to Lancelot by his own choice, and he is constantly acting very possessive of him in regard to both Guinevere and Arthur. In the beginning, Lancelot moves in with Galahad in the country of Sorelois, from which he originally hails. Following the False Guinevere episode, in which Lancelot saves Guinevere from the bewitched Arthur, Guinevere goes to join them there. Next, Arthur extends an invitation to Galahad to become a member of the Round Table. Additionally, Galahad is the one who is successful in persuading Guinevere that she is capable of returning Lancelot's affection. In the prose Tristan and its adaptations, including the account that is included in the post-Vulgate quest, Lancelot himself provides shelter in his castle for the fugitive lovers Tristan and Isolde as they attempt to escape from the vengeful King Mark of Cornwall. Because he is loyal to Queen Guinevere, he does not accept the aggressive advances made by Queen Morgan Le Fay, who is Arthur's sister and an enchantress. Morgan is persistent in her efforts to woo Lancelot, whom she lustfully loves and despises with the same great intensity. She is constantly trying to seduce him. She has even kidnapped him on multiple occasions, once with her gang of other magical queens, which at one point included Sebille. Morgan agrees to temporarily release Lancelot in order to save Gawain on one occasion, as described in the prose version of the story, on the condition that Lancelot will return to her immediately afterward. She then releases him under the additional condition that he does not spend any time with either Guinevere or Galahad for a period of 1 year. Because of this condition, Lancelot becomes half insane, and Galahad becomes ill as a result of his intense desire to be with him. Galahad eventually succumbs to his agony and passes away as a result of receiving a false rumor that Lancelot committed suicide. Princess Elaine of Corbenic, who is the daughter of the Fisher King, also falls in love with him, but she is more successful than the other members of the audience. Lady Elaine uses magic to trick Lancelot into thinking that she is Guinevere, and as a result, she is able to deceive him into having sexual relations with her. The subsequent pregnancy leads to the birth of his son Galahad, whom Elaine will then abandon so that he can grow up without a father figure in his life. Galahad eventually reveals himself to be the good knight that Merlin had predicted, who is destined to perform great deeds and who will discover the Holy Grail. On the other hand, Guinevere becomes aware of their affair, and she becomes enraged when she discovers that Elaine has used magic to trick Lancelot into having sexual relations with her for a second time, and this time in Guinevere's very own castle. Lancelot is expelled from Camelot after she places the blame on him. As a result of her reaction, Lancelot becomes even more irrational. After running away and disappearing, he spends either 2 or 5 years wandering around in the wilderness. During this time, Guinevere, who is feeling badly about her actions, and the other people are looking for him. After some time has passed, he makes his way back to Corbenic, where Elaine welcomes him with open arms. Lancelot is cured of his insanity after being shown the Holy Grail through a veil. He then decides to live with her on a remote island, where he is known incognito as the Wicked Knight, Chevalier Malfait, which is the French form that Mallory also used. Percival and Hector, who had been sent to look for Lancelot by Guinevere, finally find him after 10 years have passed. The prose Lancelot narrates the adventures of them and various other knights in the quest for Lancelot. Guinevere is the one who sent them to look for Lancelot. When Lancelot finally makes it back to the court of Camelot, he immediately begins his participation in the Grail quest. Galahad, the young teenager who is estranged from Lancelot, is the one who initiates the quest. Galahad did a number of things that demonstrated his superiority to his father, including winning a duel during his own dramatic arrival at Camelot, and other actions that demonstrated his status as the most ideal knight. After further adventures, during which he suffers defeat and humiliation, Lancelot is once again only permitted to catch a glimpse of the Holy Grail. This is due to the fact that he is an adulterer and was distracted from his faith in God by earthly honors that came as a result of his knightly prowess. In the end, it is his son who is spiritually pure, who is the one who succeeds in achieving the Grail. In addition, Galahad's virgin companions, Bors the Younger, who is Lancelot's cousin, and Percival, who is Pellinor's son, are present during his ascension into heaven. In accordance with George Brown's observation, Galahad is the typological descendant of Solomon through Joseph of Arimathea. Lancelot is equivalent to David, the warrior sinner. The affair that Lancelot had with Guinevere was a destructive force that was glorified and justified in the Vulgate Lancelot, but by the time of the Vulgate quest, it was condemned as a destructive force. In the aftermath of his failure to complete the quest for the Holy Grail, Lancelot makes an effort to lead a chaste life, This causes Guinevere to become enraged, and she decides to send him away. However, they quickly reconcile and resume their relationship, as it had been before Elaine and Galahad. In the course of a trial by combat, Maleagant is put to death by Lancelot as he attempts to demonstrate that Guinevere has been unfaithful. Also, Lancelot saves the queen from being accused of murder by poison when he fights as her champion against Mador de la Porte, upon his timely return in another episode that is included in Mallory's version of the story. Throughout the entirety of the prose, Lancelot engages in a total of 5 duels of this kind. However, 3 of Gawain's brothers, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth, die when Lancelot and his family and followers arrive to violently save the condemned queen from being burned at the stake after Morgan finally tells Arthur the truth about Lancelot and Guinevere. In the course of her rescue, the bloodthirsty Lancelot and his companions slaughter the men who had been sent by Arthur to guard the execution. This includes the men who had gone unwillingly and without weapons. Lancelot also kills his own close friend Gareth, whose head he crushes in a fit of rage. Agravain is killed by Lancelot earlier, during his bloody escape from Camelot, as well as Florent and Lovell, 2 of Gawain's sons, Arthur's nephews, who accompanied Agravain and Mordred in their ambush of Lancelot in Guinevere's chambers, along with several other knights from Scotland. Mallory's version, on the other hand, does not include these individuals. According to the Vulgate Mort Artù, an Irish knight by the name of Elians possesses the seat that Lancelot formerly held at the Round Table, but has since vacated. Arthur's loyal knights, including some of the king's own relatives, are murdered, which sets in motion the chain of events that ultimately result in Mordred's act of treason, as well as Arthur's disappearance and appears to be his death. In the Vulgate Mort Artù, the big Roman war that was taking place at the end of Arthur's reign was replaced by the civil war that took place between Arthur and Lancelot. This war was introduced in the chronicle tradition. As the story begins, Arthur and the vengeful Gawain engage in a series of battles against Lancelot's faction. They first besiege Lancelot at Joyous Gard for a period of 2 months, and then they pursue him with their army into Gaul, which is referred to as France in Mallory. Mordred, the king's cretinous son, and a former disciple of Lancelot's, eventually betrays Arthur by making a false announcement of his death in order to seize the throne for himself. This is the ultimate consequence of this situation. In the meantime, Gawain challenges Lancelot to a duel on 2 separate occasions. Gawain's enchantment causes Lancelot to delay his fight each time because it causes him to become more powerful between the hours of morning and noon. Gawain is then killed by Lancelot with Galahad's sword, but Lancelot chooses to spare Gawain's life in the Vulgate, despite the fact that Hector urged him to kill him. In spite of this, Gawain's head wound ultimately proves to be fatal in the future when it reopens on the battlefield with Mordred in Britain during the war. When Lancelot receives a letter from Gawain, who is dying, pleading with him to forgive him and asking for his assistance in the fight against Mordred, he rushes back to Britain with his army. However, upon his arrival, he is informed that Arthur has passed away at Salisbury Plain, which is a Romance version of the Battle of Camlan. Lancelot's death can be interpreted in 2 primary ways, both of which involve him spending his final years as a hermit monk, sequestered away from society. An exception to this rule is Lancelot's later participation in a victorious war against the young sons of Mordred and their Briton supporters and Saxon allies, which provides him with partial atonement for his earlier role in the story. In the original version of Mort Artù, after mourning the death of his king, Lancelot withdraws from society without any further involvement. The event takes place not long after Guinevere's passing, and it is during the battle at Winchester that Lancelot personally kills one of Mordred's sons after chasing him through a forest. However, he suddenly disappears without a trace. Hector, Bleobaris, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury were the only surviving members of the family when Lancelot passed away from his illness 4 years later. It is inferred that he desired to be laid to rest next to the king and queen. However, he had previously made a promise to be laid to rest at Joyous Gard next to Galaho, and he is requesting that he be laid to rest there and honor his promise. Later on, when King Mark wreaks havoc on Arthur's former kingdom, the Post-Vulgate depicts King Mark destroying the burial site as well as the bodies of Lancelot and Galiho. Unlike the version that is included in Le Morte d'Arthur, there is no conflict with the sons of Mordred. In the story, Guinevere becomes a nun and blames all of the destruction of the Round Table on their adulterous relationship. This relationship is the source of all of the dismay that then followed. For the final time, she tells Lancelot to go back to his lands and that he will never see her face again. She also refuses to kiss him one more time. Lancelot, upon hearing this, declares that he will also take a life of penitence if she is willing to do so with him. Hector is one of the 8 members of Lancelot's family who decide to join him in a monastic life and retire to a hermitage in order to seek redemption. Later on, he performs the final rites over Guinevere's body, who had converted into an abbess while he is a monk. He is given a warning that she is dying in a dream, and he decides to go see her. However, Guinevere prays that she might pass away before he arrives, and she does. As she had previously stated, he never saw her face again in real life. The body of the queen is brought to be buried next to King Arthur by Lancelot and the other knights who accompanied him after her death. It is then that the health of the distraught Lancelot begins to deteriorate. Le Morte d'Arthur states that even before this time, he had lost a cubit of height due to his fastings and prayers, and he passes away 6 weeks after the death of the queen because of his health. His 8 companions eventually make their way back to France to take care of the affairs of their respective lands. However, in response to a request made by Lancelot on his deathbed, they embark on a crusade to the Holy Land, where they ultimately perish while fighting the Saracens, also known as Turks in Mallory. By the hand of one of the best knights in the world, a hermit using Lancelot's exhumed skeletal arm to knight the unnamed son of Tristan, is depicted in the romance Isaure le Triste, which was written in the 14th century. Lancelot was a character who appeared in a number of Arthurian films and television productions, and he was even sometimes the protagonistic titular character in some of these adaptations. He's been played by Robert Taylor in Knights of the Round Table, 1953, William Russell in The Adventures of Sir Lancelot, 1956 to 1957, Robert Goulet in Camelot, 1960, Cornel Wilde in Sword of Lancelot, 1963, Franco Nero in Camelot, 1967, Luke Simon in Lancelot du Lac, 1974, Nicholas Clay in Excalibur, 1981, Richard Gere in First Knight, 1995, Jeremy Sheffield in Merlin, 1998, Phil Cornwell in King Arthur's Disasters, 2005 to 2006, Santiago Cabrera in Merlin, 2008 to 2011, Christopher Tavares in Avalon High, 2010, Cinque Walls in Once Upon a Time, 2012 to 2015, Dan Stevens in Night at the Museum, Secret of the Tomb, 2014, and Martin McCready in Transformers, The Last Knight, 2017, among others. When compared to the typical depiction of Lancelot in the legend, the novel The Once and Future King, 1958, written by T.H. White, depicts him in a very different light. In this scenario, Lancelot is extremely unattractive and reserved, and he has a hard time interacting with other people. In the 1975 film Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is based on the Arthurian legend, John Cleese portrays the character of Lancelot. In the section titled Sir Lancelot the Brave, he is depicted as an awkward knight who is prone to sudden and uncontrolled outbursts of violence. This section demonstrates his misguided and bloody rampage to save a princess who turns out to be a prince and who did not really require rescue. A stage musical adaptation of the film Spamalot was performed in 2005, and he also plays a significant role in that production. During the first Broadway production, Hank Azaria was the actor who played the role of Lancelot. According to this interpretation, Lancelot is gay, and he weds Prince Herbert, who was portrayed by Christian Borle in the Broadway production of the Shakespeare play. In the short story, The Last Defender of Camelot, 1979, written by Roger Zelazny, the magically immortal Lancelot ultimately passes away while assisting Morgana in rescuing the world from the madness of Merlin in the 20th century. Within the context of an episode of The Twilight Zone from 1986 that was based on the story, Richard Kiley portrays him. Lancelot is a character in the novel The Mists of Avalon, 1982, written by Marion Zimmer Bradley. He is also known by the name Galahad, and he is the estranged son of Viviane, who is known as the Lady of the Lake. Morgaine's cousin and first love interest, he is a handsome and great warrior. He is also the protagonist's first love interest. He is bisexual and loves both Gwenwyfar and Arthur. He is portrayed by Michael Vartan in the film adaptation of the novel, which was released in 2001. The Warlord Chronicles trilogy, which was written by Bernard Cornwell and published between 1995 and 1997, features Lancelot as a significant character. According to this interpretation of the story, Lancelot is portrayed as a prince of the lost kingdom of Benoic, who is both self-centered and cowardly. He abandons the kingdom to be destroyed by Frankish barbarians. In order to seize the throne of Dumnonia, Lancelot plots against Arthur with Guinevere, incites a Christian rebellion, and defected to the invading Saxons. He ultimately ended up being hanged by his own half-brother Galahad and by the narrator Derfel, who had lost his daughter as a result of Lancelot's plotting. The glowing depictions of Lancelot that are found in legends are explained as being nothing more than an influence of the stories that were generated by the bards that his mother hired. The character named Sir Launcelot, who is based on him, is one of the main characters in the animated series Blazing Dragons, 1996. However, in the series, he is portrayed as a dragon who is overweight, arrogant, and cowardly. He is also the leader of the Knights of Camelot. In Gerald Morris's Squire's Tales series, which ran from 1998 to 2010, Lancelot is a character who appears on multiple occasions. In certain books, he plays a significant role, while in others, he is secondary to the main characters. The first impression that is given of this version of Lancelot is that he is a skilled knight who is also somewhat arrogant and selfish. In later books, he is depicted as more humble and wise, and he renounces court because he is filled with regret over his affair with Guinevere. Although he decides to leave court in order to pursue a career as a woodcutter, he is nevertheless occasionally drawn into quests to assist Arthur and other knights. The video game Age of Empires. 2. The Age of Kings, which was released in 1999, includes a paladin variation of Lancelot. It is from the point of view of Lancelot that Jack White's novel Clother the Frank, which was published in 2003, is told. It begins with him as a young child and continues until he arrives in Camelot and meets Merlin and Arthur Pendragon. Beginning with his childhood, it follows his journeys. Iowan Gruffudd portrays Lancelot, one of Arthur's warriors, in the film King Arthur, 2004, which is not a fantasy film. Lancelot is one of Arthur's warriors. During the Battle of Badon Hill, he saves the young Guinevere and successfully kills the Saxon chieftain Cynric, both of which result in him suffering a fatal wound. In the French comedy television series Camelot, 2005 to 2009, Thomas Cousseau played the role of Lancelot du Lac. In the show, he is portrayed as the only competent knight of the Round Table and a classically chivalrous hero, in contrast to all of the other knights, but he is still doomed to fail. According to the video game Sonic and the Black Knight, 2009, Jason Griffith played the role of the character. When it comes to appearance, Lancelot is modeled after Shadow the Hedgehog. According to Ryotaro Okiayu, Kyle Herbert, Lancelot is portrayed as the servant Berserker in both the light novel and its accompanying anime adaptation, Fate Zero, which was released in 2011. There is also a Berserker version of Lancelot in the mobile game Fate/Grand Order, but he also makes an appearance as a Saber-class servant. The character Lancelot is featured in the romance novel Knight Fantasy Knight, also known as Qishi Huansheng Ye, written by Vivi Bear in 2013. This novel was subsequently adapted into a comic book in Samanhua. The codename Lancelot is utilized by the character Roxanne Roxy Morton, played by Sophie Cookson, in both the film Kingsman: The Secret Service, 2014, and its sequel released in 2014. Within the prequel, it was also utilized by the character of Archie Reed, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. In the first season of The Librarians, 2014, the primary antagonist is a character named Lancelot, who is portrayed by both Matt Frewer and Jerry O'Connell. Through the use of magic, he was able to achieve immortality at some point after the fall of Camelot, and he has spent centuries trying to undo the events that led to the destruction of Camelot. As the enigmatic du Lac, which is a respelling of his name Dulac, he is the leader of the Serpent Brotherhood, a cult that has been resistant to the library's mission for a long time, which is to prevent magic from falling into the hands of humans. As Guinevere's brother, Lancelot is a playable character in the video game Mobile Legends: Bang Bang, 2016. Mobile Legends: Bang Bang was released in 2016. Lancelot, a novel written by Giles Christian and published in 2018, is an original retelling of the story of Lancelot. The immortal Lancelot du Lac, whose voice is provided by Gareth David Lloyd, is a co-protagonist in the adventure video game Du Lac and Fay: Dance of Death, 2019, which takes place in Victorian London. Cursed, a novel written by Frank Miller and Tom Wheeler and printed in 2019, features illustrations. The violent Christian fanatic known as the Weeping Monk is known as Lancelot. Daniel Sharman will portray him in the adaptation of Cursed that will be released on Netflix in the year 2020. Rupert Penry Jones provides the voice for the main character, Lancelot, in the animated series Wizards: Tales of Arcadia, 2020, which will be released in 2020. The video game Smite features Lancelot, a horseback assassin who is armed with a lance. Lancelot is a playable character. There are 4 knights named Lancelot in the manga series 4 Knights of the Apocalypse. Lancelot is one of the titular knights. His parents, Ban and Elaine, are his parents. Lev Grossman's novel, The Bright Sword, which was published in 2024, features Lancelot as a primary antagonist. In this novel, Lancelot is the most skilled swordsman in Britain. Following Arthur's death, he ascends to the throne under the name Galahad, which is his illegitimate son.